have two purposes this afternoon in this first presentation. Number one, I want to take the opportunity to introduce you and acquaint you a little more clearly with the White family. Because I think when we understand what our heritage is, we connect with it more closely. The second thing I want to do is to talk about the title of this message that I'm planning to share with you, and that is Ellen White's passion for God's love in Jesus. So that's our purpose this afternoon. If I could have a couple of people help me, I have copies. Pastor Phil has made copies of the White family tree, and there are, I believe, plenty here for everyone. If you want to take an extra copy, that's fine. To take it and share it with a family member or a friend, that would be fine. In our second session this afternoon, and we'll just take a brief stretch break between the two, I'm going to talk about the four boys in the White House. James and Ellen White had 4 sons. What happened to them? How did they impact the lives of James and Ellen White? How did they balance, as your pastor asked in the question that he put on the sheet, how did they balance family and ministry? Important questions, and maybe some answers that will be a bit surprising to you. But we hope that our time together will be profitable. I come to you not as a theologian, not as a scholar, but as a member of the White family. I'm a great-grandson of James and Ellen White. And if you want to look on the family tree, I can show you where that is. In fact, let's take some time and meet the White family. Before we do that, I think the first thing we need to do, and Pastor Phil did an admirable job in the worship service this morning, of establishing the biblical basis of a gift of prophecy beyond Bible times. But I just want to review from a slightly different perspective that concept again. So we don't have a slide on the screen. We're going to create a slide in our minds. You want to do that? Create a PowerPoint slide with me? So the next slide is, at the top of the slide, it says Biblical Foundation. And there are 3 major chapters in the Bible that I believe, in addition to a number of other texts, establish clearly the validity of the gift of prophecy. But I want to offer a warning this afternoon. Sometimes we as Seventh-day Adventists have thought that because we believe in and accept and validate the gift of prophecy as manifested through the life and ministry of Ellen White, that's all the spiritual gift we need. And it isn't. Spiritual gifts were given to empower the church for mission and service. And they're given to each member who seeks and desires and prays for the ministry of the Holy Spirit in their lives. So the 3 chapters in the Bible that we're putting on the screen, first is 1 Corinthians 12. You're creating this slide in your mind's eye, right? The second one is Romans 12. And the third one is Ephesians 4. Now let me share excerpts briefly from those 3 passages. In Romans 12:6, it says, different gifts are given to us according to God's grace. Us, that's you and me. You have a spiritual gift or spiritual gifts. And one of the gifts noted prominently, as Pastor Phil mentioned, is the gift of prophecy. Then if we go to 1 Corinthians 12, verse 1, it says, concerning spiritual gifts, I don't want you to be what? Ignorant. In other words, I want you to understand and be knowledgeable regarding spiritual gifts. And then in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 12, it says, the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. To each one for the profit of all. In Ephesians 4, that's our third chapter, Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and Ephesians 4. It says, when Christ ascended up on high, he gave gifts. And then the gifts are noted. And in verse 12, it says, the purpose of the gifts for the equipping of the saints, for the ministry of the body of Christ, and for the edifying of the church. And again, the gifts lists are mentioned, and the gift of prophecy is prominent. Joel 2:28-31, your sons and your daughters will prophesy. 1 Thessalonians 5:20, don't despise prophesying. Revelation 12:17, God's last day church will have the testimony of Jesus, and the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 19:10, is the spirit of prophecy. We're not doing an exhaustive study. In fact, we're not doing a deep study at all, but I want to establish first and foremost that the gift of prophecy is biblically based. If it's not, we don't have any business being here and talking about it. But it is. It's biblically founded and based. Okay. Let's take a look at the family tree. I want to acquaint you with the White family, with my family. At the top of the tree, James Springer White and Ellen Gould Harmon. James was born in 1821. Ellen was born in 1827. They were about 6.5 years apart, age-wise. As far as we know, James and Ellen did not get acquainted until after the great disappointment of October 22, 1844. But it was their common interest in trying to understand what God was doing in 1844 that eventually drove them together. And we don't have time to talk about the courtship and marriage of James and Ellen, but that's another interesting story. Ellen Harmon was less than 19 years old. She was still 18 when she was married to James, who was 25. 1 year later, they had their first son. And if you look at the 4 boxes under the family tree, you see the 4 sons: Henry Nichols, James Edson, William Clarence, and John Herbert. Of those 4 sons, and we'll talk about this more in the second presentation, only 2 of them lived to anything beyond teen age. The first son to die was John Herbert as an infant, 3 months of age. The second son, 3 years later, was Henry Nichols, who died as a teenager at 16. We'll talk about that and how the enemy targeted these boys when they were born to undermine the ministry of their parents. The second son that was born was James Edson and then William Clarence. Of the 4 sons, only Willie, W.C., the third son, had children. Although Edson was married, he never had any children. And so if you look on the left side of the family tree, you can see where it says first family. Do you see that? Willie married a lovely young lady by the name of Mary Kelsey White. She was 19, I think he was 21 or 22 when they were married. She was one of the youngest editors. She was a writer, an author, one of the youngest editors at the Review and Herald. And she worked alongside him. They were married for 14 or 16 years. Well, I will get into that story. They had 2 daughters. The first daughter was Ella on the left side of the trunk of the family tree, and the second daughter was Mabel. And those girls had children, and those children had children. And that is what is called the first family, because they were first in terms of chronology. Unfortunately, in 1885 through 87, when Ellen White and Willie and Mary and their firstborn daughter went to Europe for 2 years and lived in the 4th story of the publishing house in Basel, Switzerland, Mary Kelsey got tuberculosis. She didn't die when they were in Europe. She came back, and they tried to nurse her back to health. She lived for a little more than 2 years after they got her back to the United States, and in 1890 she died. That left Willie with 2 young daughters, Ella and Mabel, who were at that time about 9 and 4. Let's go ahead and get away from this family tree. You can see James Springer White. This is a picture of him probably in his late 30s, early 40s. James did not age well. He did the job of 2 men throughout the course of his life. And of course, next picture, Ellen Harmon. This is a picture of her probably also in her 30s or so. And next we have a picture of what I've been talking about. This is the remaining family of James and Ellen White after the teenage son and after their infant son passed away. You, of course, recognize James and Ellen. And this is Edson. Now, his name was James Edson, but he always went by Edson so he wouldn't be confused with his father. And this is his younger brother by about 5 years, Willie, who was my grandfather. So this is the primary family, my great-grandparents, my great-uncle, and my grandfather. As I mentioned, Willie is the only one that had children. Married to Mary Kelsey, had the 2 daughters, Ella and Mabel. And then, let me go back to that picture. Here's a picture of Ella standing and Mabel seated. They were lovely ladies, very talented. We'll talk a little bit more about their families subsequently. This is a picture of the second family. In 1891, Willie went to Australia with his mother and left his 2 daughters in California. In Australia, Willie met and married a young lady by the name of Ethel May Lacey. And by her, he had 5 more children. And these are the children, the twins, and they're on the right side of the family tree, and it's called the second family, the twins, Herbert and Henry, their sister, Grace, my dad's older brother, Arthur, my uncle, and there's Dad, Francis. Looks like a little girl, but he's not. He's a little boy. Oh, now I'm not advancing. Next slide. There we go. This is a picture of my Uncle Herbert, one of the twins. Next picture of my Uncle Henry, another one of the twins. Next slide. No, we went back. Forward. There we go. Next slide. Thank you. Let me see if this clicker is going to work or not. The twins, Herbert and Henry, they were born shortly. This is my Aunt Grace, who was a wonderful lady. She was the caretaker. How many of you have ever visited Elmshaven? Okay, in Northern California. Grace was the caretaker at Elmshaven for many, many years. Her husband, John, and she were there, and they were there simultaneously with, part of the time, with the Kubrocks. You ever heard that name? Dan and Gladys Kubrock. Gladys was a great-great-granddaughter of Ellen White on the first family side right here, Gladys and Dan, and they did their part in multiplying the family. They had 6 children, and their son Tim, their youngest son, is now principal at Lodi Academy in Northern California. Then there's a picture of my uncle Arthur, who was the secretary of the E.G.White estate for many, many years, wrote the 6-volume biography of Ellen White, and took his father's place as sort of the secretary of the E.G.White estate. And finally, oops, 2 slides. Having a little trouble with this. There we go. Nope. That's my father, Francis. And he was the youngest. Now, can I tell you a little story? When my grandmother, Ethel May Lacey White, was pregnant with my father, she was a little bit nervous because she knew that she was going to be 40 years old when her last child, my dad, was born, and she was nervous as to what Ellen White would think about her having a child in her later years. But those fears and that anxiety were assuaged the very first time she took my dad in to see his grandmother, and for her to see her youngest grandchild. Ellen said this, and I quote, "I have prayed that I would live long enough to see the youngest of your children, May." That's what she called my grandmother, May. "I have prayed that I would live long." She was 85 when my dad was born, and her health wasn't all that great. And we can imagine, and I believe this truly to be the case, that she took my dad in her arms and cuddled him and talked softly to him and told him how much she cared for him, and then said, "May, would it be okay if I had a prayer for little Francis?" And prayed for my dad. I believe that my dad was a prayed-for baby. He was the youngest of Ellen White's grandchildren, and she loved him very, very much. Now, she only lived less than 2 years after he was born. My dad was 22 months old when Ellen White passed away in 1915. He was born in 1913. So people ask me, "Did you ever meet your great-grandmother?" Well, no. My dad barely met her. She died in 1915 when my dad was less than 2 years old. But Dad was a spark plug in the White family. He was the one that put together White family reunions on a regular basis. We went to Bass Lake and to Yosemite. We went to Rio Lindo Academy. We had family reunions, and we would have as many as 120 people show up for White family reunions. We haven't had those kinds of reunions since he's been gone. My dad died in 1992, and I still miss him. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. So here is a, there it is. Here's a picture of a loving, integrated family. Ellen White is right in the middle here. Her son Willie and his second wife May. Daughters from his first marriage, Ella and her husband, Mr. Robinson, and Mabel and her husband, Mr. Workman. Two of the Robinson children, Virgil and Mabel, and then 4 of the 5 children from the second marriage, Herbert, Henry, Grace, Arthur. My father was yet just a twinkle in my grandmother's eye when this picture was taken. It was probably taken a year or so, maybe around 1912, before my dad was born and before Gladys Kubrock, the third of the Robinson children, was born. Gladys is still alive. She's 95 years of age, and she lives in Yountville in California. But this was a happy family. You know, people tend to think, and your pastor referred to that this morning, and I've heard it said, wind up the Ellen White doll, and what does she say? No, 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 no. But that's a false picture. It really is. As I mentioned briefly in the interview this morning, Ellen White was, as her prophetic gift led her to do, she was occasionally called to point out misdirection in a person's life. She was occasionally called to give correction and to help people in a better way. And sometimes she had to confront people. This was not a pleasant part of her prophetic journey. It was something she did. She did it diligently and she did it faithfully, but it was not something that impassioned or empowered her. It was something that she had to do. And sometimes we've gotten stuck on that instruction, direction, correction pathway with Ellen White and missed so much of what she was really all about. She was a loving, caring person who was the center of a wonderful family. This is a picture I already showed you. Here's a rather jovial picture of some of the White family. And I know you can't see it very well, but Herbert and Henry are both here. Grace is here. And my grandmother, Ethel May, is right there. And if you could see this picture clearly enough, my dad is tucked down between his mom and his older brother. And Arthur is riding the hood of this old Model T. The White family loved each other. They cared about each other. They were not perfect. They had challenges and problems, but they didn't focus on the negative as too many have over the course of the years with Ellen White. And I believe that it's because her motivation and her passion was not to focus on the negative, but was to focus on the love of God in Jesus Christ. So that leads us to Ellen White's 3 spiritual passions. If I were to ask you this afternoon, what do you think were the 3 things that were really vitally important to Ellen White? Well, I would suggest, first of all, that it was the love that she had for God in Jesus. And my wife helped me make an alliteration out of this, so we have 3 L's. Her first love was her love for the Lord. We're going to come back to that. Her second love was her love for God's Word, the Bible. And I want to mention a couple of things about that with you. What did she say about the Bible? Well, you've heard some of the things that she said, but let me read a couple. The Lord has given what did she call her writings? Lesser light to lead us to the greater light. So she loved the light. She loved God's Word, the Bible. She said the Bible and the Bible alone is to be our creed. I believe that Ellen White was an unmitigated Bible loyalist. In her last address to the General Conference in session in 1909 in Battle Creek, Michigan, Ellen White gave her talk, turned around to head back for her seat on the platform, and paused. And she turned back around, she walked back to the pulpit, and she picked up the large pulpit Bible on the podium at Battle Creek, Michigan, and she held it up, and she said to those delegates of the General Conference in session, "I commend to you this book. I commend to you this book." Then she set it down and went back to her place on the platform. What do you suppose her third passion was? I believe that her third passion was her love for those who were without God, without Jesus, without Christ, her love for the lost. She wrote shortly after conversion, "I have pledged that every energy of my life should be devoted to the work of winning souls to Him." Her favorite text, most quoted text, you know what it is? I venture that not many of you know what it is. Matthew 5, verses 14 and 15. You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. In a camp meeting in Fresno, she was in her 70s, and she wrote this: "I would go to the ends of the earth to bring men and women a knowledge of the truth for this time." So she had a deep love for the lost, she had a deep love for the light, and she had a deep love for the Lord. Now I'm going to share with you this afternoon a few quotations. Don't get bored at the fact that I'm reading you a few quotations. I'm doing this for a purpose, and I'll tell you why. I could express what I believe to be Ellen White's feelings, but I think she expresses it most clearly, most succinctly, and in a most compassionate and convincing way. So, for the next few moments, we're going to look at what I believe to be her greatest passion. Foremost, she had a deep love for God and a passion for Jesus Christ. And I think one of the missions of Ellen White was to help clarify the character of God. So much maligning, so much fake news in regard to the character of God. So she had a deep passion for God's love. I want to read this quotation, which is among some of those that I believe are very moving. Christ's favorite theme was the paternal character and the abundant love of God. This knowledge of God was Christ's own gift to men, and this gift he has committed to his people to be communicated by them to the world. Christ's favorite theme. I believe we could impose the words Ellen White's favorite theme was the paternal character and the abundant love of God. Another quote, this time from the 5th volume of the Testimonies. All the paternal love which has come down from generation to generation through the channel of human hearts, all the springs of tenderness which have opened in the souls of men are but as a tiny rill to the boundless oceans when compared with the infinite, exhaustless love of God. Yet you can never fully comprehend the length and the breadth, the depth, and the height of that love. Ellen White used to like to use the word matchless charms or matchless depths. I don't have this quote on the screen, but it is from first volume of the Testimonies. It says, "If Christ be in us, the hope of glory, we shall discover such matchless charms in him that the soul will be enamored." Another quote from Spiritual Gifts. "I lay down my pen." Evidently, she was writing and she was musing, and she said, "I lay down my pen and exclaim, oh, what love, what marvelous love, the matchless depths of a Savior's love." In another quote that is on the screen, she said, "My whole being longs for the Lord. I'm not content to be satisfied with occasional flashes of light. I must have more." Just a year before she died, Ellen White was interviewed by C.C. Chrysler, and he asked her a question. And she said, "I find tears running down my cheeks when I think of what the Lord is to his children, and when I contemplate his goodness, his mercy, and his tender compassion." And then another quote that is on the screen, "The love of Christ will animate the believer with new life." Another quote from Desire of Ages, "What shall account for this great love wherewith he has loved us? We cannot understand it, but we can know it is true in our own experience." You see why her words were so powerful? She has an ability to, and was it Pastor Robles was talking to me shortly after church. And Dan and I worked together in Central California and then in Arizona. And he said, "Aren't you sort of amazed at the kind of vocabulary that Ellen White had, since she only had a 3-grade education?" And it's true. And if you read the early writings of Ellen White, you see some simpler forms of expression, but as you read further and later in her life, her vocabulary and her understanding of the concept of God's great love expands, and it's wonderfully amazing. As you know, maybe you don't, Ellen White had a twin sister by the name of Elizabeth. Ellen used to call Elizabeth Lizzie, and Lizzie used to call Ellen Ella. It was early in 1891 that Ellen White received word that her sister Elizabeth was not doing well. This is before she went to Australia. For one reason or another, Ellen couldn't visit her sister, but she wrote her a letter. And in this letter, she expressed her feelings and attitudes toward Elizabeth and toward her own work. And in this letter, which I don't know if it's published, there's some real heartfelt expressions that are given. I need to find the right sheet. I'm sort of spread out here in a mess. Here we go. Excuse me just for a minute while I find this. It went away. There it is. Okay. So this is Ellen's letter to her sister Elizabeth, who was really dying. She said, I love to speak of Jesus and his matchless love, and my whole soul is in this work. I have not one doubt of the love of God and his care and his mercy and his ability to save to the utmost all who come to him. Now the letter gets a little more personal. Don't you believe in Jesus, Lizzie? You see, Lizzie had married a gentleman by the name of Reuben. They went into business, and they didn't stay with the Advent movement. I don't know whether they were even active in any kind of a religious organization. And so Ellen was concerned for the soul salvation of her sister. She said, do you not believe that he is your Savior, that he has evidenced his love for you in giving his own precious life that you might be saved? All that is asked of you is to take Jesus as your own precious Savior. I pray most earnestly that the Lord will reveal himself to you. Dear sister, it is no wonderful thing that you have to do. Friends cannot save you. Your physician cannot save you. But there is one who died that you might live through eternal ages. Just believe that Jesus will hear your confession, receive your penitence, and forgive every sin and make you a child of God. Will you give yourself in trusting faith to Jesus? And now it gets very intimate, very personal. I long, and I can hardly read this without tears coming to my eyes. I long to take you in my arms and lay you on the bosom of Jesus Christ. With Jesus as your blessed friend, you need not fear to die. For it will be to you like closing your eyes here and opening them in heaven. Then we shall meet, never more to part. Yeah, it is published too. I'm not remembering the gentleman right now in an article that he wrote about Ellen White's passion for Jesus. This was a letter written to Elizabeth Bangs, that was her name, February 21, 1891. Now, one of the questions that often comes up is, well, what was the response? And the answer is, we don't know. There's silence. We don't know if Lizzie wrote a letter back to her sister, because it's not recorded anywhere. We don't know if Ellen had further correspondence with Lizzie. But with a heartfelt, compassionate, personal appeal like that, who could say no? I choose to believe, and this may be a bit presumptuous, but I choose to believe that when you and I get to heaven, we will have the privilege of seeing Elizabeth and Ellen embracing under the tree of life. God is a compassionate Savior. There's another presentation that I have, which I don't have time to share with you, where I talk about the roots of James White's experience with God and Ellen White's experience with God. And if you read Life Sketches, you get a pretty clear picture of the struggle that Ellen White had when she was a young girl, starting at the age of 8, trying to reconcile her feelings of unworthiness with the concept of a loving God, and struggling with ever feeling like she could be worthy to be called a child of God. And so, as a result, she ultimately was able to make that commitment to put her faith and trust in God, and it changed her whole perspective of the kind of God that He was. She had a deep compassion for those that struggled with that self-worth concept, with people that just didn't think they would ever be good enough to be God's children. And I want to say something, now I'm getting preacherly, I know, to you this afternoon. I think we, as Christians and as Adventists, have thought, if I'm good, God will accept me. If I'm not, I'm going to be rejected of God. God has a love that has dimensions that are so far beyond that concept of behavior that are important for us to understand, that it really help to change our picture of who God is. God loves us when we're good. He loves us when we're bad. So she had some things to write, to say to the down and outers about the love of God. Let me share just a few things with you. And I'm going to put this on the screen if it will respond. Though all are precious, this is from the book Education, though all are precious in His sight, the rough, sullen, stubborn dispositions draw most heavily upon His sympathy and love. For He traces from cause to effect. The one who is most easily tempted and is most inclined to err is the special object of His solicitude. Isn't that an amazing statement? The one who is most inclined to err, the most easily tempted, is the special object of His solicitude. In another quote from first volume of the Testimonies, Christ exercises much pity for our weakness and loves us although we err. How many of you have been told, maybe in Sabbath school or have heard others say it, well, God will love you when you're good. You know, we've got to clean up our act, then we can come to God. I think that's false theology, folks. Another couple of quotes that aren't on the screen. The fact that He has erred does not make Him less dear to the heart of God. That's from Review and Herald, May 12, 1896. And then she wrote, Jesus does not call us to follow Him and then forsake us. If in our ignorance we make missteps, Christ does not leave us. Christ does not leave us. Another quote that's on the screen, the weakest of human beings may live in contact with the living Christ, and He will hold them by a hand that will never let go. One other concept I want to share with you from a few selected quotations is the concept of Christ our righteousness. We thought that behavior is the ultimate test of our acceptability to God. But faith is the ultimate test. Do we trust God to do for us what we can't do for ourselves? So let me share a few quotations with you in regard to righteousness by faith in Christ our righteousness. There's not a point that needs to be dwelt upon more earnestly than the impossibility of fallen man meriting anything by his own best good works. Salvation is through faith in Jesus Christ alone. Salvation is through faith in Jesus Christ alone. From the book Faith and Works, page 19. Not on the screen, we need to have far less confidence in what man can do and far more confidence in what God can do for every believing soul. He longs to have you expect great things of him. I love that. Another quote not on the screen. Jesus loves to have us come to him just as we are. It is his glory to encircle us in the arms of his love and to bind up our wounds and to cleanse us from all impurity. Just a couple of more quotes and then we'll wrap it up. This is from Desire of Ages, and this is an awesome quote, page 762. The law requires righteousness, a righteous life, a perfect character. And if we stop there, religion could be pretty discouraging. She goes on to say, this righteous life, perfect character, this man does not have to give. He cannot meet the claims of God's holy law. But Christ, coming to earth as man, lived a holy life, developed a perfect character. This he offers to us as a gift to all who will receive them. His life stands for the life of men. Thus they have remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. Christ Object Lessons. I love that book. Don't know if I'll have time to mention it to you this afternoon, but while Ellen White was in Australia, those were 9 of her most productive years. She finished the book, Desire of Ages. She wrote the book, Christ Object Lessons. She got published the book, Steps to Christ, and she wrote the book, Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings. These are 4 of my favorite Ellen White books. They're all the inspirational books. And so in spite of the fact that she didn't know if she should go to Australia or not, she did much productive work while she was there. This is from Christ's Object Lessons. Only the covering which Christ has provided can make us meet to appear in God's presence. This covering, the robe of his own righteousness, Christ will put upon every believing, repenting soul. This robe, woven on the loom of heaven, has in it not one thread of human devising. Christ in his humility wrought out a perfect character, and this character he offers to impart to us. Yes, perfection is required of us. When we accept Christ, his perfection is credited to us by faith. Okay, one final thing. This is a picture of my Aunt Ella. She was the firstborn of James and Ellen's grandchildren. She was the firstborn daughter in the first family. She was quite a live wire. She lived to be 95 years of age. She was very devoted, a wiry, active, wonderful, happy Christian lady. Before she died in 1977, someone from the White estate went to her and said, "You knew your grandmother quite well, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes, I was well, she couldn't have said that. She was 33 years old when her grandmother passed away. So she traveled with her, knew her well, was very well acquainted with her. Tell us your favorite recollection of your grandmother." And so this is what she said, and I quote, "I see Grandma," calls her Grandma, "standing in the pulpit, dressed in her loose-fitting black sack suit, narrow cuffs of white, narrow white collar." Now, gentlemen, leave it to a woman to describe what another woman is wearing. Now, if a guy had done this, he wouldn't have worried about that, but it adds a dimension of interest. Narrow white collar, secure at the throat by a small brooch. Now the important stuff. She's been telling of the matchless love of Christ. Even his running the risk of separation from his Father. By taking upon himself the sins of the world. She pauses. She looks up. And with one hand resting on the desk and the other hand lifted heavenward, she exclaims in a ringing voice, "Jesus, how I love you. Jesus, how I love you. Jesus, how I love you." There is a deep hush. Heaven is very near. The favorite recollection of her grandma. You know, we as Seventh-day Adventists have many blessings and insights and privileges. When people drive by the Simi Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church, what do they say? Those are the people who go to church on Saturday. Yeah, they do. We're here. Those are the people who know a lot about Bible prophecy. We do. Those are the people who have a health message. And maybe the Simi Valley Hospital was founded because partially of the healing desire in that health message. Those are the people who have correct doctrinal understanding. Those things are all important, folks. They really are. Wouldn't it be wonderful? And maybe it is the case if when people drove by the Simi Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church and any other Seventh-day Adventist church worldwide, wouldn't it be wonderful if it could be said by the observers, those are the people who know and love Jesus Christ. Those are the people. If you really want to get acquainted with Jesus, go and worship with that group of people. Because they'll love you to death, and they'll talk to you about the love of God in Jesus Christ. What a challenge for us, huh? In this day and age, when the character of God has been so distorted and besmirched, when there's so much fake news, we need to have the real news of God's great love in Jesus Christ. Okay, that's the end of that presentation. I want you to stand and take a 2-minute stretch break, okay? If you need to do a potty break, go ahead, but we're going to start before you get back. Take a stretch break, stand up, stand on your tiptoes, raise your hands, take some deep breaths. You're actually doing pretty good. Not too many of you fell asleep. A few, but that's okay. I started there in 69.
And you left when?
9 years later.
Okay, because I was treasurer of the Central California Conference 74 to 77.
Okay, well,
you were
yes.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Marshall Chase.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember you.
We went to Singapore from Singapore.
Yes.
I forget where you...
Before we actually start this second presentation, let me share just a few facts of interest with you. Ellen White was sick in Australia for the first year after she arrived. She was anointed and was not miraculously healed, but eventually she got better. So after about a year of going through illness and struggling, she got better. Ellen White, in some instances, loved the water. In fact, she took a sailing ship out under the Golden Gate, and the waves were running high. And when she got back, she said, "I have never enjoyed anything so much in my life." Interestingly, later on, when she was in Australia and she was on a rocking ship, she said, "I didn't enjoy that at all." So evidently things changed with time. James White died in 1881 at the young age of 60. You know, I used to think 60 was old. It's not, folks. because I'm in my 70s now, and 60 is young. But James White died in 1881. He had no grandchildren. His first granddaughter, Ella, was born the next year. So he didn't even know that he had grandchildren. So I've imagined in my mind's eye James White in heaven. Okay? Here's James White. And here are 7 people lined up in front of him to introduce themselves to their grandfather. Hi, Grandpa, I'm Ella. Hi, Grandpa, I'm Mabel. And then the twins, Herbert and Henry, and then Grace, and then Arthur, and then Francis can introduce themselves to their grandpa in heaven for the first time. Isn't that going to be joyous? Ellen White had her first vision December of 1844 at the age of 17. As I mentioned in church, she had approximately 2,000 visions and prophetic dreams between 1844 and 1915. After 1884, the visions were mainly prophetic dreams, and she had no daytime visions. She wrote over 100,000 pages by hand, 25 million words, more books, translated into more languages, circulated further than any other woman in history. And she's the 3rd most translated author in the world. We don't hear that much about Ellen White. In 2015, Ellen White was named by Smithsonian Magazine as one of 100 outstanding Americans, based on the volume of the work that she did. They fed a bunch of information, and so she was there along with Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln and so forth.
That wasn't printed in the Review and Herald. I never saw a word of that. That's why a lot of stuff doesn't get to our people. They look at the sewers that should be in, and it wasn't there. So,
You know, I don't know. I don't know.
somebody should take retirement after that.
Who was the editor then, huh? Did you know that Ellen White liked auctions? Particularly, not because she was a hoarder or because she wanted to collect things for herself, but because she wanted to be able to buy inexpensive things that she could give to other people. When she was in Australia, she did amazing work among the people. She was a friend to many people. She used to buy wood and blankets and this and give it to people. She was very humanitarian. She very much practiced what she preached. You want me to share just a little bit about her sense of humor? Okay. Ellen White did have a sense of humor. She had a horse by the name of Dolly. Now, over the course of her life, Ellen White owned a number of horses and cows and livestock and that kind of thing. But this horse seemed allergic to work. And so Ellen White wrote, "She stares at the mountains and hills as if she were a tourist viewing the scenery." In 1885, she was sailing for Europe on the SS Cephalonia. They were supposed to leave on Sabbath, so her and her party made arrangements to get on the boat on Friday afternoon in order to be settled for the Sabbath. She noted in her diary, "We accomplished this nearly." So she wasn't a legalist, you know. When after a boat trip, she stepped out onto the dry land, she said, "When I got off the boat, when I walked up through the streets, it seemed to me as though I was still on the boat. And I would step so high that people must have thought I was drunk." She had a brother by the name of John. The main means of communication was correspondence by letter. Evidently, Ellen was a better letter writer than John was, so she wrote to him, Dear Brother John, I have written you several letters, but have not heard one word from you. We concluded that you must be dead. But then again, we thought if this was the case, your children would have written us. She showed her humor in a practical vent when she wrote about the careless dress of certain women. Their clothing often looks as if it flew and lit upon their persons. And she wrote, sisters, when about their work, should not put on clothing which would make them look like images to frighten the crows from the corn. She had another comment about another horse when they were in Europe. She was in Italy and enjoying some of the sunny days after a stretch of rain, and wrote in her diary, we drove very slowly, for the horse, although strong, had no idea of hurting his constitution. Finally, in her later years at Elmshaven, Ellen White was given cold mitten friction treatments. Have you ever heard of something like that? You take a rough cloth or a washcloth and rub with cold. And she had this done to stimulate her circulation. Someone applied cold water and then rubbed her with mittens to increase circulation. Twice a week she was given a salt rub or a salt glow. The salt was put in the water to stimulate the circulation. One day she sensed a difference in the liquid, so she touched her finger to it and tested it. The worker had used sugar by mistake. With good humor, Ellen White observed, just trying to sweeten me up, huh? So just a few things of interest. Now we're going to talk about the 4 boys in the White House. And I want to begin by suggesting, well, let's go back. No, let's stay right here. Again, we have the 4 boys, Henry Nichols, James Edson, William Clarence, and John Herbert. And these are pictures of 3 of them. The 4th is not. This is Henry Nichols, this is James Edson, this is William Clarence, and this is a picture, because we don't have a picture of little John Herbert, because none were taken during the 3-month period that he was alive. But that's a facsimile from that era. These are my words. The enemy worked diligently to discredit and destroy the ministry of James and Ellen White, first by attacking them significantly through health issues, and then by attacking each of their 4 boys as they were born and during the course of their early lives. Ellen White was not healthy when she got married. She only weighed 80 pounds, and this is what one physician wrote about her when she was married. Her right lung is decayed, her left lung is considerably diseased, her heart action is impaired. The diagnosis, and they had interesting names for diseases in those days. The diagnosis is dropsical consumption. That doesn't sound very appetizing, does it? And that was a form of tuberculosis. Her life expectancy is very short, and she's liable to drop away at any time. Ellen White had to be propped up so that she could sleep, and at times it seemed that this TB would take her life. She only weighed 80 pounds. Frequently while traveling and sometimes at home, she would faint or fall into a coma and remain in that state for minutes and sometimes even longer periods of time. So the enemy worked on her health. We tend to think of James as being healthy, and in my other presentation, which I didn't have time to give to you today, James' early life was fraught with many problems. He had what they called worm fever. And as a result of the worm fever, his eyes crossed severely, so much so that he couldn't read. So he was put out in the field when he was old enough by his father to do farm work, because that was the main means of income in those days. And as he worked in the fields, his body became stronger and stronger and stronger. And at the age of 17, he wrote and said, I became strong and my eyes uncrossed. My eyes became completely normal. Well, that's miraculous in and of itself, to have cross eyes correct themselves. At the age of 19, James went to school for the first time in the first grade. In 12 weeks of schooling, James acquired all his elementary and part of his high school education. And when he graduated from that 12 weeks of schooling, he taught school the next year. But James' health was not always good, and he said this of his health: although I inherited a powerful constitution, imprudence in study at school and in lecturing had made me a dyspeptic. So what's that sound like? He had upset stomach on a regular basis. And did you know that because of an accident in a sawmill, after James taught in school for his first year, James had a limp all of his life? He limped. So, God has called this woman, 80 pounds, weakest of the weak, she called herself, and James to be co-founders of not just a church, but a movement. Isn't it amazing the way God works? Yes. A year after they were married, and they were married by a justice of the peace on a Sunday and went to meetings Sunday night. I don't know that they ever had a honeymoon, but they dearly loved each other. A year after they were married, they were living with Ellen's parents, the Harmon family, not always the best thing. And Ellen was pregnant with their first child, and they had their first son a year after they were married. His name was Henry Nichols White. I want to tell you the story of how he got his name, because you'll be intrigued by it. Ellen White became very ill not too long after James and Ellen were married. So ill that they thought she was going to die. And so they developed a prayer team that would come into the home and pray for her on a regular basis. And she would seem to get better, and then she'd drop back again. And this prayer team would come, and the word got out. Sister Ellen is ill. It got 100 miles away to a family called the Nichols family. And the Nichols family wanted to do something to show their support and encouragement for Ellen White. And so they sent their 17-year-old son, Henry, on horseback in the wintertime to go and visit, sort of as an emissary from the Nichols family, to visit and bring encouragement. Now, the thing that was said of Henry Nichols, 17-year-old teenage boy, that boy knew how to pray. That boy knew how to pray. Henry Nichols arrived. The prayer team was at the home of the Harmons. Ellen was laying on the couch. Henry joined the prayer circle, and when it was his turn, he began to pray. And he prayed diligently that Ellen White would be healed. And as he was coming to the conclusion of his prayer, he was, as if it were, compelled to get up from his knees, to walk across the room, and to place his hand on Ellen and to say, "Sister Ellen, Jesus Christ maketh thee whole." And he fell back. And Ellen later said it was as if electricity went through my body and I was healed. She was healed miraculously. Now, Henry Nichols wasn't a healer. He was just a young boy who knew how to pray. And God chose to use his ministry to Ellen to heal her. A few months later, when their first son was born, what did they name him? Henry Nichols White, after the young boy, the 17-year-old boy who had come and who had prayed for Ellen. I love that story. Isn't that awesome? Ellen and James found themselves in a dilemma. You know what a mother's heart is. Stay home, make a nest for her family, take care of her children. But they were called to do ministry. Henry became ill, very ill. They prayed, Lord, if you heal Henry, we'll do whatever you want, because they'd been resisting going out and doing ministry as they started their family. Henry was healed. They decided that it was important for them to follow what God had wanted them to do. And in spite of the fact that it was very difficult for them, they put Henry in the care of another family. Oh, here we go. For the good of souls, Ellen White wrote in Life Sketches, we must sacrifice the company of our little Henry, alone before the Lord and with most painful feelings and many tears. I made the sacrifice and gave up my only child for another. We left him in Brother Stockbridge Howland's family, in whom we had utmost confidence. Stockbridge Howland was an early convert to Adventism who was an engineer and a bridge builder and a fine Christian man who had a fine Christian family. It was thought that they would leave him for maybe a year to do their missionary trips to churches and to small groups and to minister to people who had been experiencing this disappointment thing that so many people had gone through in 1844. But their life was dedicated to service and to traveling and to suffering. And Ellen White wrote this, because that year extended to a second year and a third year and a fourth year and a fifth year. For the first 5 years of his life, Henry Nichols was raised by the Stockbridge Howland family. She wrote this. Stockbridge Howland doesn't look too user-friendly. In fact, somebody came to me during break and said, we never see Ellen White smiling. And I have a couple of theories about that. Because we don't see any of the early pioneers smiling, do we? There's your family tree. I have a couple of theories. Number one, photography wasn't then what it is today. Your pastor just got a new phone. He's very excited about it. And, I have an iPhone, and we can take pictures on our phones that are amazing. Well, in those days, people had to hold still for a long period of time. And I think that it's easier to hold a solemn face than it is to hold a smile. And so they didn't smile, they just held a solemn face while they were being photographed. But there's another reason. Frequently, people in those days had bad teeth. Frequently. They didn't have near the dental care that we have nowadays. Some of the dentists put in wood pegs for teeth, and so people had blank spots in their smile, which is really ugly. And so maybe that's why they didn't smile. And thirdly, the early Advent believers were so sincere about the soon coming of Jesus that they just wanted to be perceived as being very diligent, very solemn, and very dedicated to that task. And so they didn't want anybody to think that they were too jovial. Those are my theories. Take it or leave it. Ellen White wrote this in Life Sketches. This just tears at my heart when I read it. Although the cares that came upon us in connection with the publishing work and other branches of the cause involved much perplexity, the greatest sacrifice The greatest sacrifice which I was called to make in connection with the work was to leave my children frequently in the care of others. So there was that balance, but maybe even sometimes an imbalance between ministry and family, between mission and family. Second child, born to James and Ellen White, was James Edson. And there's probably a reason for his name, too. He was named after his father. And do you remember the name Hiram Edson? Well, it was in his barn that supposedly the truth about 1844 was discovered, and they did a lot of study there. And so he was well known, and I would guess that maybe James and Ellen, when their second son was born, wanted to name him. Edson always went by the name Edson. He didn't go by the name James, because that would have confused him with his father. When he was born, at 9 months, the family had to travel. They left him in the care of someone. The child was very feeble when they got back. She said a great change had taken place in him. It was difficult to suppress murmuring thoughts. After they arrived home, the baby grew worse. They would say sometimes he was blessed, and then the disease would be stayed, and then the symptoms would get worse. And one night they were awakened by screams, and they rushed to him, and he would fight the air with both hands, crying in terror, "No, no, no!" And then he would cling to his mother. And she said this about that. We knew this was Satan's effort to annoy us. Now, I probably would have used a stronger word than that. We knew that this was Satan's effort to annoy us, and we kept in prayer. My husband rebuked the evil spirit, and in the name of the Lord, Edson quietly fell asleep. I have another incident about Edson's life when his life was saved. They moved to Rochester, New York. There was a cholera epidemic. Edson became very ill with cholera, but he was saved, and ultimately he became, as Ellen White said, quite rugged. When she wrote regarding Edson's childhood illnesses, she said, Satan wanted to hinder the work of the Lord, so he afflicted the children. Satan wanted to hinder the work of the Lord, so he afflicted the children. But he was beaten back by faith in God, and his name shall have the glory. It has been just so. He knows this work will hurt his cause and save some jewels. That is why he rages so, but he is driven back. So she affirms that concept that the enemy worked to defeat the work of their ministry by attacking their children. A third son was born to James and Ellen. W.C. William, or Willie White, as he was frequently called, was my grandfather. So I have particular interest in him. I was at the school yesterday. Were any of you at the school yesterday when I told the story of Willie in the wash tub? Okay, there are 4 or 5 of you. Thank you. I think I'll tell it again real quickly. James and Ellen White were invited to move to Battle Creek, and Willie was about 15 months old. 6 or 7 months later, they decided to have what I would call today strategic planning meetings in Battle Creek to strategize as to how they could spread the gospel of Adventism and the soon return of Jesus farther and more quickly. And so they called all Adventists who were interested to come to these meetings in Battle Creek, and all the believers in Battle Creek were expected to open their homes to house the people who would be coming from out of town and out of state. And the Whites were among them, and so they were cleaning their house. The boys, who were like 11 and 9, were out in the front yard raking, and little Willie was 22 months old at this point in time. 2 girls stayed with the Whites, Jenny and Clarissa, to help them out, to cook. When the Whites were in Rochester, New York, they housed all the people who worked in the printing shop in Rochester, 15 people, and they fed them all. They all lived with the Whites. And so Jenny was no, Clarissa was hired to do the cooking for that group, and they came to Battle Creek with the Whites when they came. Ginny was going outside to get some wood for the fire. They had just cleaned the floors in the house, which were old rough-sawn boards. They'd scrubbed them by hand and had a big, big tub of sudsy water that was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. And little Willie was playing. He found a stick and a little piece of wood. Ginny walked by and said, "What are you doing, Willie?" And he said, "Sticky boat, sticky boat." Well, he had a stick and he was pushing around this piece of wood back and forth and pretending that it was a boat. And so he was playing in the water. And Ginny went outside, and it took her longer than she thought it was going to take her to get the wood. And when she came back in, she looked around, and Willie was nowhere to be seen. And so she called out, "Willie." And then she took a harder look, and she saw something that horrified her. She saw a little foot sticking out of this tub of sudsy water. He had leaned over and fallen head first into this tub and had drowned. Well, Ginny screamed, "Willie's drowned! Willie's drowned!" And that brought Ellen, still in her 20s, young mother, and she plucked Willie from Ginny's hands and said, "Was the water hot or cold, Ginny?" And Ginny was so shook up. "He's drowned, he's drowned." Ellen said, "Was the water hot or cold?" And Ginny said, it was cold. She sent Ginny to go get James and to go get a doctor, and Ellen took a pair of scissors and cut off Willie's wet clothes as she headed out toward the front yard and put him on the grass and began to roll him around on the grass, back and forth, back and forth. And as she did that, that was her way of doing artificial respiration. The water began to pour out of his mouth and nose, bubbles and water, and every few moments or every few minutes she would pick him up and see if he was breathing, and he still wasn't breathing. This lasted for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. By this time, James had come back. He was standing, watching, praying. Some of the neighbor ladies had gathered around. Some of the neighbor ladies said, "Somebody needs to take that dead baby away from its mommy." And James said, "You leave her alone. She knows what she's about." 20 minutes. Ellen took her little baby and put his lips up to hers and kissed him on the lips. And he tried to return the kiss. And he began to breathe. And Ellen White said, "He's alive, thank God he's alive." And she took blankets and put them around him, took him in by the fire. All the house cleaning at the White House stopped for that day, for sure. Of course, she was worried. Wouldn't we be worried without oxygen for 20 minutes? And it's verified that he would have brain damage. Willie grew up to be a normal, healthy, highly functioning adult. He became her secretary in her later years after James passed away. Why did she ask whether the water was hot or cold? Well, if the water had been hot, his respiration would have been elevated, his heart would have been beating faster, he would have needed more blood supply, but the water was cold, and so his respiration was slower. However, after 20 minutes, I don't care how slow somebody's respiration is, they're going to suffer brain damage. Willie didn't. I believe that God chose to intervene because God had a plan and a purpose for Willie's life, and the enemy, again, was thwarted by the intervention of a very diligent mother, of a praying mother and father, and of the ministry of God's healing hand on that precious little boy. And I'm very glad that he lived, folks, because this family tree that you hold in your hands would not exist. There would be no White family because Willie is the only one that had children. There would be no first family, no second family, no Francis White or Charles White. So I'm glad that God chose to make my grandpa well. Praise him. a fourth child was born. And interestingly, he was born, 6 years after Willie was born. Interestingly, they didn't have a name for him. I don't know if they had run out of names by now. I don't know why they named Willie William Clarence. I have a theory for the first two, but they didn't have a name for this baby. But Ellen White seemed to be quite pleased when she wrote to her husband James, who after the baby would turn 3 weeks old, James left for a trip to visit churches and so forth. So Ellen White wrote to him, and that's the way they communicated. Baby is fat and healthy. He promises to be a very rugged boy. He's quite good at nights, but I will tell you one thing. He is so hardy, it will cost you quite a bill to keep me and him. She went on to say, he eats and throws it up and is just as greedy to eat again. All is well in Battle Creek as far as I know. At 2 months, little baby weighed 15 pounds. He was a hardy little guy. James wrote back to Ellen a few days later and said, I fear that all is not well at home. I have had some impressions as to the baby. A presentiment that the child was very sick, lying before me with face and head swollen. Ellen responded to James' letter that she did not have much faith in his presentiment. But the very next day, the baby became very sick, with an extremely swollen face and head. The diagnosis, well, it's ultimately erysipelas. Have you ever heard of that? It's a bacterial infection of the skin, which children are particularly vulnerable to, which this little baby, finally in his 3rd month, who was named John Herbert, had. And they didn't have the antibiotics to be able to treat it in those days. And so the baby suffered for 24 days and then died. And you know, we see the delivering hand of God in the life of Henry Nichols, in the life of Edson, in the life of Willie, and we ask ourselves, don't we ask ourselves, why? You know, why didn't God intervene for little John Herbert? Why? We don't understand. We don't know. There are those of you in this room that have had tragic losses that are inexplicable. Ellen said this about the loss of her son. She said, at times I could not control my feelings. Among other things, she said, despondency and gloom settled upon me. Is it possible for the divine prophet of the Lord to get depressed? Of course it is. Of course it is. And she was. We followed our child to the Oak Hill Cemetery, there to rest until the life-giver shall come and break the fetters of the tomb. I think I do have this quote. No, I don't. Let me read this to you then. Until the life-giver shall come and break the fetters of the tomb and call him forth immortal. After we returned from the funeral, my home seemed lonely. I felt reconciled to the will of God, yet despondency and gloom settled upon me. The enemy had attacked, and it seems that he was victorious, but not ultimately victorious. 3 years later, in 1863, Henry Nichols' firstborn son is 16 years old. The Whites are traveling again. So I ask you, who is the prophet in this marriage, James or Ellen? Well, Ellen is, of course. But they're traveling again, and James has another impression from a dream. He says, I fear that all is not well with the children. And so they returned early from their trip. And when they got back, they were greeted at the train station by their 3 boys singing them a song, but they noticed that Henry Nichols had a cold. And the next day it turned bad and turned into what they called in those days lung fever. What do you suppose it was? Pneumonia, yes. And he became very ill. Again, they didn't have the right kind of antibiotics to treat him, and ultimately he died. On December 7, 2 days before Henry died, he was asked for his father, James, who prayed with him and soothed him and held his teenage son. We tend to think of James as rather austere, goal-oriented, maybe a bit impersonal, but here he held his precious son and assured him of his parents' love and of his love. The next day, shortly before he died, Henry said to his mother, "Mother, I will meet you in heaven in the morning of the resurrection." "For I know that you will be there." His last words were, "Heaven is sweet." James and Ellen White, within a period of 3 years, lost their youngest son, their baby, and lost their teenage firstborn son. My wife has a Bible. I gave it to her when we got married 37 years ago. She doesn't take care or treat her Bible like I treat mine. Actually, somebody stole mine, so I don't have it anymore. But she puts all kinds of things in her Bible: poems, quotations, text. She marks it. Look through the pages of her Bible, and she dates things that she marked that were important to her at certain points in time in her life. And she's an amazing, wonderful Christian lady. And she had in her Bible this quotation, among many others. So I'm going to skip ahead to this. I'll come back to what Ellen White wrote. I'm sorry, having a little trouble. There we go. This is the quote from Desire of Ages. "Let this bring comfort to those of you who have been or who are or who might be brokenhearted. Not a sigh is breathed, not a pain felt, not a grief pierces the soul, but the throb vibrates to the Father's heart." Know that you're not alone when you go through suffering and grief. I'm going to skip back, I'm sorry, and read what Ellen White wrote about Henry. "When our noble Henry died at the age of 16, when our sweet singer," now all of the Whites were talented musically, "when our sweet singer was borne to the grave and we no more heard his early song, ours was a lonely home. Both parents and the 2 remaining sons felt the blow most keenly. Edson was 14 and Willie was about 9 when their older brother passed away." She wrote, "But God comforted us in our bereavements, and with faith and courage we pressed forward in the work that he had given us, in bright hope of meeting our children who had been torn from us by death in that world where sickness and death will never come." Was there heartache in the White's family? You bet there was. These poor people suffered much, and the enemy sought to make his inroads to undermine their ministry, but he couldn't do it. I'm going to skip through this part because I don't want to keep you too long this afternoon. In 1865, James had a stroke. His arm went limp, and it led to an over 2-year period of healing for him, which also involved probably what today would be called a nervous breakdown. Ultimately, Ellen decided to nurse him back to health. She cut back on her work, and she said he had taken care of me all of his life, so now it's my turn to take care of him. She wrote, Satan's purpose was to destroy my husband and to bring him down to the grave. So again, the enemy was working diligently to destroy. I want to talk briefly. You want to give me another 15 minutes? Is that okay? If you need to leave, don't worry. But I want to talk briefly, primarily about my grandfather Willie, but first about Edson, very briefly. These are pictures of Edson, who was now the oldest son after his older brother passed away, probably as a teenager here, maybe 16 or 17, as a young man in his 20s, and then as an older man in his 60s or 70s. Edson had a unique ministry. Some of you know about it, some of you have studied. But Edson, in his 40s, had sown his wild oats and decided to really rededicate his life to God. In doing that, he felt called to do ministry in the South to impoverished black Americans up and down the Mississippi River, and he decided to do it via a riverboat. So he had built a riverboat called the Morning Star, took it up and down the Mississippi River, spent a lot of time around the city of Vicksburg, and evangelized often poor and frequently illiterate black people. One of the means of ministering to them was to teach them how to read and write. It was very controversial. Edson was disliked by the power-hungry slave owners, sometimes not accepted by the black people, but he felt called to that ministry and did it diligently for a number of years. Here's a picture of Edson and his wife, Emma. Emma was a talented musician. She played the pump organ, sang beautifully. Edson sang. And this is a picture of the riverboat that they had built. An amazing piece of machinery with three decks. And out on this second deck, they would set up to 150 chairs that would accommodate people. Emma would begin to play the organ, and Edson would sing, and people who lived along the banks of the river would hear it, and they would go down and be invited onto the boat, and they'd sit down, and then Edson could share music and education and preach to them. OSHA would have really been upset because there are no railings on that second deck, but an amazing work that Edson did. If you want to read more about it, there's a book that was printed in the 70s by Ron Graybill entitled Mission to Black America. You can get a copy online, probably through Amazon, that kind of thing. I got a used copy a while back because somebody borrowed permanently the copy that I had in my library. And it's an intriguing study about the ministry and mission of Edson. And Ellen White encouraged him strongly and often sent him money. And when he got discouraged, she would write him timely letters. I want to conclude by talking about my grandfather, Willie White. Unfortunately, I never met my grandfather either. Not only did I not meet my great-grandmother, but I never met my grandfather because he died in 1937. He was 83 years of age. He died in Northern California at Elmshaven with the keys to the vault at Elmshaven in his pocket. He worked up until the day that he died. He had a heart attack and he was taken suddenly. This is a variety of pictures. Willie about 10 or 11, then as a young man in his 20s. This is about how he looked when he married his first wife. Then as a young man in his late 30s, this is about how he looked when he married his second wife, and probably in his late 70s here. He was an amazing guy. I already showed you this picture of the integrated family, so I'm not going to go over it again, but Ellen White is in the middle. This is probably two or three years before she passed away. And this is the integrated family. This next picture is a picture of the second family, which I already showed you. Herbert and Henry, Grace, Willie, Ethel May, Arthur, and my dad, Francis. Very briefly, Ellen White helped to define the mission and the role of her two sons, as it had earlier been revealed to her. Now, she kept this to herself for many years. After the death of my husband, I was instructed that the Lord had appointed W.C., that's Willie, to do a special work in connection with my writings. The Lord promised to give him of his spirit and grace and a spirit of wisdom and of sound judgment. The Lord appointed him as my helper. And she went on to say further, there it is. No, there it isn't. There it is. The eldest son has been sorely tempted. Now she's talking about Edson. And must be transformed. And the youngest must stand in the counsel of the Lord. He has borne his test wisely, and the Lord will help him to continue the work appointed. Then she added this, as a mother would, let no jealousy come in because of the position I have appointed the youngest. In other words, Willie had more responsibility than Edson. Although their work was so different, it doesn't seem that there was any jealousy. They just each did important ministry as God called them. This is my grandfather, Weeping Willie and Sleeping Willie. I want to tell you why they called him Weeping Willie and why they called him Sleeping Willie. When Willie was touched by something emotionally, when he was sad, when he was happy, when he felt emotions of love, he used to cry. Now, most often we're taught, you're a man, don't cry. And that's unfortunate. But Willie was able to express and share his emotions, and he would cry, and the tears would run down his cheeks. I only have one picture of Willie without a beard. The tears would run down his cheeks and drip off the edges of his beard. And so they called him Weeping Willie. But they also called him Sleeping Willie. And I think this story is factual, but I don't have a lot of evidence to support what has been handed down verbally. Whenever Willie was on the platform, if he wasn't speaking, he would fall asleep. It was inevitable. And you know how it used to be, Phil. Chairs on the platform, Phil and Jan. All the pastors sat up here, whoever had the scripture, whoever was going to have the benediction, whoever had the prayer, whoever had the offering appeal. They all sat on the platform and they would come up. I had a head elder in my church in Bakersfield, California, that was a dear man, hardworking. He was a pharmacist, and he had 3 boys, and he worked hard to support his family. And whenever he was on the platform, he would inevitably fall asleep. And you could just see old Ozzie, his head would start to nod back, and then he kind of awake. Oh, but Willie fell asleep automatically when he was on the platform. And it's my understanding that one day A.G. Daniels, who was a good friend of the White family, he was president in Australia when they were there, and then he came back to the United States, and he was president of the General Conference in the United States. One day A.G. Daniels was preaching, and Willie was sitting on the platform. He was supposed to have the benediction, the final prayer, after the sermon. And A.G. Daniels was really getting into his sermon and was making his point strongly and really wanted some support. And so as he made this particular point, after he pounded the pulpit, he turned to my grandfather and he said, "Isn't that right, Elder White?" And Willie, who was sleeping, woke up with a start, looked around, stood up, raised his hands, and said, "Shall we rise for the benediction?" Well, it wasn't time for the benediction. So he sat back down, and Daniels continued his sermon. Willie probably even fell asleep again, and finally offered the benediction. Interestingly, Ellen White had an explanation, maybe even an excuse for her son. She said, "You must excuse Willie, because when he was a baby, we would take him in his bassinet, and when I was preaching, we would place his bassinet right below the pulpit, and he would hear my voice, and he would fall asleep. And when his father was preaching, he would hear his voice, and he would fall asleep." And she said, "Willie has never outgrown that habit." So that's the story about weeping and sleeping Willie, my grandpa. One of the first people that I'm going to look up in the new earth is my grandpa. This is a picture of Willie about the time that he married Ethel May Lacey. Do you want me to take the time to tell you quickly about their courtship? The White men were not very romantic. James was not romantic in his proposal to Ellen. He just said to her, "Well, it looks like we should get married." And Willie was not very romantic in his proposal to Ethel May Lacey. I need to give you a little bit of background. Ethel May Lacey went to and took the Bible instructor course at Melbourne Bible College, which was the precursor to Avondale, which was the college that was established in Australia by Adventists when Ellen White was there. And she completed the Bible course. And Ellen White would frequently go to the Bible school in Melbourne and visit and speak for chapel and so forth. And she spotted this fine, devoted, lovely Christian girl by the name of Ethel May Lacey, who was British, and her father had retired in Tasmania. And the family had come into the truth because of a colporteur that came to their door. Well, Ellen White needed some help in her home, and so she asked Ethel May, she approached her and asked her, "Would you be willing to come and live in my home and help me?" Not as a servant but as a companion, as someone to help out with this and that and the other many multiple things that Ellen White had to do. And Ethel May thought about it and prayed about it and decided that she would. Evidently, along the way, somewhere in this sequence of events, Willie must have noticed that Ethel May was in their home, and he observed her, obviously, and one day, without any dating, without any in-depth courting, without any major significant conversations, Willie decided to propose to Ethel May and walked up to her and said, "Would you marry me?" And it sort of caught her off guard, you can imagine. And she said, "Well, no, I can't. There are 3 reasons I can't. Number 1, I have a boyfriend. His name is Arthur. Number 2, I have a school debt." She was indebted for the tuition that she hadn't been able to pay off from her education at Melbourne Bible College. And she said, "I will never marry a man while I'm still in debt. And number 3, it seems that the man I marry should be someone that I love. And I don't love you, Willie." And so Willie, nonplussed, said, "Well, I'm off to New Zealand for several weeks. Would you pray about it?" Well, what Christian is going to turn down an invitation to pray about something? And so she said, "Yes, I'll pray about it." And of course, he was praying about it, and Ellen White knew of this, and she was praying about it. And Willie went, I think he was gone for 6 to 9 weeks to to New Zealand. And when he got back, we can imagine I'm not doing that. We can imagine that he was anxious to visit with Ethel May Lacey to find out if anything had changed. And so he finally got an opportunity to be in her presence and said, I'm back. Is there anything that has changed? And she said, well, interestingly, there is. Number one, Arthur was the name of her boyfriend, broke up. Number two, someone paid off my school debt. Who do you suppose it was? Okay, some say Willie, some say Ellen. It was Ellen. Ellen paid off her school debt. I made the mistake of saying once in one of my presentations when I was talking about this, Ellen was a matchmaker. Well, somebody came up and chastised me because she said no one should ever be a matchmaker. She was an encourager. So she paid off the school debt. And third, Ellen said, I believe that I could love you. So they got engaged. And less than a year later, they were married. Before they got married, Willie sent for his two daughters from California, from the United States, to come over. So they got to meet their stepmom, their mother-to-be, and they immediately fell in love with her. Interestingly, and here's sort of the scandalous part of the thing, Willie was 40 and Ellen was 21. So there's quite an age difference. Ethel, I'm sorry, did I say Ellen? Thank you. Ethel May was 21. And they were married, and immediately this 21-year-old wife of Willie had daughters, 13 and 9. So, and 1 year later, Willie and Ethel May had twin boys. So by the age of 22, married for a year, she had 4 children. Plus the management of the GWhite home, which was visited regularly by denominational officials and people and visitors and guests. This picture is a lovely picture of her. She looks quite calm and well coiffed and everything. I have not seen a picture after this one where she looks as well kept. I don't know if you remember the picture with the 6 children, with the 5 children around her. Her hair's a little tousled. She looks a little more tired, that kind of thing. Well, she worked hard. She was a devoted, wonderful wife and mother and hostess. She was an amazing lady, and although I never met my grandfather, Willie, I spent many, many, many hours with my grandmother, because after Willie passed away at age 83, she was only 64. And so she would come to the houses of her children and spend weeks on end. And she spent time at our house in Mountain View, California. And I love my grandmother. She said, call your friends in, I'll tell them stories. And so she did. She told them stories. She'd tell them fun stories, and then she'd tell them stories about Jesus. She was still witnessing. And I remember she loved the Bible, and she was memorizing the book of Revelation. And she said, Charles, I want you to check me out. I've memorized Revelation 21. See if I know it. And so she gave me her Bible, King James Version. And she said, now follow along. I want to see if I know it. So she repeated word for word the whole chapter of Revelation 21. I think she left out one "the" to see if I was paying attention. And you know what that did? That instilled in me, first of all, a recognition of the deep regard that she had for Scripture. And then it instilled in me a deeper love for Scripture, too. So it was a wonderful thing. I don't want to wear you out, but there is the rest of the story. Do you want to hear that? Are you sure? I really don't want to wear you out. Oh, maybe I didn't explain that. In 1885, the question is, what happened to Willie's first wife? In 1885 to 87, Willie and Mary, his first wife, went with Ellen White to Europe. And they lived in the fourth story of the Basel, Switzerland publishing house. She contracted tuberculosis. Before she got tuberculosis, she had their second daughter while they were in Australia. Mabel was born in Australia. Mabel was born in Europe, in Basel, Switzerland. They brought her back to the United States and tried to nurse her back to health. She got tuberculosis, and they were not successful. She died in 1890. And Willie married Ethel May in 1895, I think it was. Yes. So he went to Australia with his mom, and that's where he met and married Ethel May. But, of course, Willie was nearly 20 years older than his wife, and so she outlived him. In fact, she lived to be 96. But after Willie passed away, there was a gentleman that also had married and had a productive life by the name of Arthur Corral. Arthur was the boyfriend of Ethel May when Willie approached her about marrying him. Arthur married, was a pastor first of all in the Samoan Islands, and then he came to Northern California. He had one son. His wife passed away. And Willie's wife, Ethel May and Arthur began to correspond. And they wrote letters to each other, and they rekindled that relationship that many, many years before had existed. Both of them had had good marriages. They had been loyal to their spouses. And it's like God was putting a little frosting on the cake for both of them and saying, you each need companionship in your later years. And so my cousin, Oliver Jacques, who was Grace's son, who was a pastor, performed their marriage ceremony. And they were married for 7 years. And she outlived him, too. So it was a blessing to her. She was very happy with Arthur. They enjoyed each other thoroughly. In fact, when I was a student at Pacific Union College, my grandmother, who had outlived both of her husbands, was a resident at the St. Helena Sanitarium nursing home. And I would go down there to visit with her, and I would want to hear stories about my grandpa, Willie, and she ended up telling me stories about my step-grandpa, Arthur, because that was her most current, recent memory, you know. So that's the rest of the story. That's not a real user-friendly picture of Ellen White, but that's quite a bit like she looked at the close of her life. And I want to share with you just one more thing, and then we'll wrap it up for this afternoon. If we're going to have a quick Q&A. I don't know if many of you remember the name Arthur W. Spalding. Spalding was a pastor and a theologian, but mainly a historian of the Seventh Day, and he wrote a number of books of history. When Ellen White, in 1913, was approached by Arthur Spalding as to being able to work with her a little bit and interview her and so forth. And so he was invited to come and live in the White home at Elmshaven for a period of about 6 months. And Arthur Spalding had a number of interviews with Ellen White. One morning, Arthur was in the kitchen ironing a shirt, and Ellen White, who was then in her mid-80s, 85, 86, because she died at 87 and a half, had her bonnet on and her work clothes on and a shovel, and she was going out in the garden to work. She loved to work in the garden. And she stopped him. And she began to talk, or she stopped him, he stopped her, and she began to talk about her children. And this is what she said that he penned from that interview. She said, "I had to leave them so much." There was a shading of sadness in her voice. "I had so often to leave them in the care of others, and not all of those who cared for them loved them or knew how to train them. I would have stayed with my children, but God told me to go. Yet my heavenly Father saved them, though with many trials, and he has given me other children, thousands of them, the children of God's people, whom I love." Then she looked Arthur Spaulding right in the eye and said to him, "You are one of my children. Are you not one of my children?" He says, "I nodded, speechless, tears in my eyes." She put her hand over mine for a brief moment. Then she smiled and with a quick movement was gone. One of our goals here today has been to sort of reintroduce you to the personal side of the White family. I hope that as a result of our time together, you feel just a little bit closer to this gift that God has given to us. I want to conclude. I already told you I was concluding. In February of 1915, Ellen White tripped on the threshold of her study. This is Elmshaven, and when Ellen White, shortly after she moved in, she had this area built over a part of the house, which became her study. She would get up early in the morning and write and so forth. She was still writing up until a year or so before she passed away. She fell and she broke her hip in February of 1915. The doctors were called. They x-rayed it, brought her back home, put a hospital bed in her home, and she convalesced there until she passed away in July. Early in July, when she was in and out of coma, her family members would come in. And on Sabbath afternoon, a number of family members came in, and they began to sing around her bed. And she was, they thought, in a coma or sleeping. And they began to sing a song and then another song, and they sang the song, which is 428 in your hymnal, "There's a land that is fairer than day, in the sweet by and by. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore." And as the family members were singing, she began to mouth the words and to sing along with them. She wanted to let them know that she was waiting for that land, that sweet by and by that was coming soon. And I look forward to meeting my great-grandmother when we get to heaven. Okay, are there a couple of questions? If you have a question or two, it's after 4 already. You've been here for 2 hours. You have a question. What's your name?
Sammy.
Sammy? Okay, what's your question?
Like why did like before why did like Earth like how like Elith May, like why did she broke up with Arthur in the first place?
Oh. Well, I think it was God's plan for her to marry Willie. And she was a wonderful mother to his daughters, and she was a wonderful mother to his children, and she lived a happy, full life. And Arthur lived a happy, full life with his wife. And then God gave them the privilege of joining back together for a few years when they were both very old. They were in their 80s when they got married. Yeah.
Where is she buried?
Where is she?
Was she buried in Maine or in California?
Ellen or May?
No, Where was she buried? Was it here in California or?
Oh, married or buried?
Okay.
Where was Ellen White buried?
She's buried in Battle Creek, Michigan. There's a white plot in Battle Creek, Michigan, where, first of all, you know, she spoke of Oak Hill Cemetery where her infant son was taken. He's buried there. Her teenage son is buried there. Her husband was buried there. She's buried next to her husband, James, in Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan. And there's there was some controversy about the obelisk or something that was there. You know, there's a pointed obelisk that's so ridiculous, I'm sorry. It was just the style of the age. It didn't have anything to do with any affiliation with anything.
Pastor, I'm gonna tell you an anecdotal story that
Okay.
I know you've never heard before. This question just triggered it for me. Our family has, for many, many years, had some very, very close friends who are now deceased, but he was a traveling salesman for a number of years, and he told a story about how he went to Battle Creek, and he had only a few hours there, and he wanted to see the plot of the White family. And it was very, very important to him, and he was wandering all around there, couldn't find anybody to help, and he prayed about it. Time was running out, and he said he saw someone who he assumed was a gardener, had some kind of tool or something, and motioned him over in that direction and pointed out the White family plot, and he turned to thank him, and he was gone.
That's interesting. Yeah. I've had members of my church that are newer Adventists that I've recommended they go to Elmshaven, and at every juncture, when I visited them after visiting Elmshaven, they were blessed, and they just felt something special there. Okay, another question or two.
There's one over here.
There's one here, okay.
Thank you for sharing your story and of your family. I was wondering something about you. Were you always, did you always know you wanted to be a pastor and continue the White legacy?
No, not always. The question was, well, I guess you all heard it. Did I always know I wanted to be a pastor? Actually, my dad was the youngest of James and Ellen White's grandchildren, and he was a great guy. He really was. Never pushed me. Sometimes when we push too hard, we get resistance. And I had an incident early in my life, and I can't tell you the whole story, but my eyesight was threatened when I was a young teenager. Something happened. My mother took a flash picture of me, and I had red measles, and it just was a bad combination. And I got down on my knees that night when my eyes were bothering me and said, Lord, if you'll save my eyesight, I'll do anything you want. I'll even be a pastor. And he reminded me of that a few years later, and I'm eternally grateful that God called me in that direction.
Pastor, I understood that you said that Ellen G. White, Sister White, was 9 years in Australia. I went to Australia, I visited her home, and Avondale is beautiful. But what was the reason that she left Australia? Because I did ask the questions in there, in the university, and I kind of didn't like the answer from them. So is there any way you can explain why she left Australia?
Probably not to your satisfaction, but I'll tell you briefly what I know. There's a new book out that you might be interested in, and others too who are interested in her years in Australia. It's called Sunnyside Stories. Sunnyside is the name of the residence that Ellen White built on the Avondale campus when she was in Australia and lived in from, I think, 96 to 2000 to 1900. And she didn't want to go to Australia initially. I know that's not the question that you're asking. she had no indication from God as to whether she should go or not, but the mission board of the denomination asked her to go, and ultimately she just decided to go with Willie's encouragement and his promise to go with her. The people in Australia dearly loved her, and she was in the heart of her work in 1900. She had students that were staying at her house. She had students that she was helping. She had people that she was getting plots of land for who couldn't get. I mean, it's amazing what she did when she was in Australia. When she left Australia, there was a scrapbook of memories that was given to her and people that wrote things in it. And I got to see that when I was in Australia at the vault in Australia, and it's amazing all the things that she did. Thank you for bringing wood to us at a crucial time. Thank you for letting us use your horse. Thank you for giving us a piece of property and letting us pay you back for it, and so forth. The people in Australia did not want her to leave in 1900, but she felt that she was needed back in the United States. That's the best I can do. She felt she was needed, and as a matter of fact, when she got back here, her ministry here continued to be vitally important to the direction of the church. There were some things happening in the General Conference that needed to be corrected. There were institutions to be built. Pacific Union College was selected after Ellen White got back at her encouragement. The hospital in San Diego, what's the name of Paradise Valley Hospital, that whole thing took place. She was instrumental in helping develop Loma Linda University. So her ministry, I'm going to take just one more moment. In Australia, Ellen White repeated a number of the things that she had done in the United States to develop ministry here. One of the things that she was heavily involved in the United States in the 1870s was the camp meeting movement. In Australia, the camp meeting movement, it was 20 years later, but it was in the 1890s, and they were doing evangelizing of people through camp meetings in Australia. So she repeated a lot what she did here, there, but some of it was even more purified because she was upset about the way Battle Creek College had been managed and operated. She went to Australia and said, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to get it out in the country. We're going to get agricultural things involved and that kind of thing. So I think that she received new motivation for a new vision while she was in Australia to do things better here. So, you know, God used that both ways. That's a long answer, but thank you. One more question. It's almost 4:20. Yes.
My question is, do you believe in the third message, that we has to live the way that you say,
The what message?
the third angel message?
Yes. Well, I've got to qualify that. Sure, I believe in the three angels' message. I believe that it's the Magna Carta of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Some of the application that she made of it in her day applies to today. The principles apply to today. Some of the specifics don't apply to today.
Oh, that was my question. So, but what about the message that we has to live in according to the health message? The way we eat, the way we grow our vegetable and everything, because I'm very confused. Some people don't believe in this time. They say this is for the old time. It was just in her time.
Well, the principles, you know, sometimes it's hard to separate principles from practices. The principles apply today. Obviously, we aren't living in an agricultural society anymore like she was. The ability to mass produce things, of course, that has introduced genetic manipulation and all that kind of thing, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to get into that. I think the principles still apply today, and I think that our challenge is to just rediscover what the principles are. I know that that's not a specific answer, but in the time allotted, I really can't give a more specific answer. Okay, thank you so much. Phil, thank you for having me here.
Absolutely.
I appreciate
Did you enjoy this? I hope you found it beneficial. You know, when I was, when Pastor Jan and I were planning this whole sermon series, and I knew I was going to be doing something on the gift of prophecy, and I had heard what, about a year ago, I heard some of these presentations that Pastor Charles had done, and, you know, I found them inspirational. I just thought it'd be really great for us to have a kind of an in-depth look at looking at a person. For those of you who grew up Adventists, particularly maybe in the 40s and 50s and 60s, maybe you saw a different Ellen White than he has portrayed today. And I think that this has given us an opportunity to see a very real person who, first and foremost, had a love for Jesus and a desire to share him with other people. So, Pastor Charles, thank you so much for taking your time to come over here and be with us and to bless our church and to share your life and your story and your heritage. And we join you in looking for that day when we will be able to meet her and James and all of that family and other members of our family and our loved ones who are waiting the resurrection. So thank you again so much for coming. Let's stand and have a word.